Hey, what's up? Welcome back to my channel. In my previous video, we discussed about the mechanisms involved in the formation of odontogenic cysts, and today I'm going to discuss about the histopathological features of one of the most important and clinically relevant cysts, and that is your odontogenic keratocyst. I'm saying the word clinically relevant because of the fact that this cyst has a very high chances of recurrence, and the reasons for recurrence can be many. It can be due to the presence of the satellite cyst within the connective tissue capsule, or it can be due to the fragile epithelial lining and also the high mitotic index within the epithelial lining. And it is also associated with a syndrome, and we all know that is nevoid basal cell carcinoma syndrome, where patients present with multiple odontogenic keratocysts, and these patients usually have a mutation in their gene called as PAT gene. Before we peep into the microscope, I sincerely thank Professor Rajendra Singh, a dermatologist from New York, who kindly allowed me to use their digital slides that helped me create this video. I strongly recommend all of you to visit their website, the link of which is provided in the comment section below. And before we peep into the microscope, first let us run the intro. Now this tissue section, it's quite clear that it is not a solid mass, instead it is cystic. The reason I am saying this as cystic is simply because I am seeing a huge void or a huge lumen within this particular mass. Now this lumen or a cavity is lined by epithelium throughout. If you keenly observe, the whole lumen is lined by epithelium, and that epithelium is in fact supported by the underlying connective tissue capsule. So going by the definition, it's a pathological cavity lined by epithelium and it has a supporting connective tissue capsule. So definitely this is a cyst and not a solid mass. Now let us see the histopathological features that can help us diagnose what type of cyst is this. So for that we might have to zoom in using higher power objective of the microscope. So let me zoom in into the tissue section, and this appears quite good. Yeah. Yes, this view is nice. So here we have a huge lumen and we have the lining epithelium, and then we have the underlying connective tissue capsule. Let's see the features in detail one by one. If you see this lumen has sparse amount of keratin. So definitely this is a keratin producing cyst. So we have a cyst that is actually producing keratin. Let's move into the epithelial lining, and the epithelial lining, if you keenly observe, most of the areas the epithelial lining appears uniform thickness right from here, and if I just move the epithelial lining, it appears uniform in most of its areas. And if you keenly notice, the junction between the underlying connective tissue capsule and the epithelium is quite flat. There are no retipex or retiridges, so we have a uniform appearing epithelial thickness, and the junction between the epithelium and the connective tissue capsule is quite flat. And we have the surface of the epithelial lining which is not smooth, instead it is thrown into folds. If you keenly observe, the surface of the epithelial lining is definitely parakeratinized. The reason I'm saying parakeratinized because I see the pycnotic nuclear remnants on the surface here, and the surface is never smooth, and you see this multiple folds. It is thrown into multiple folds, and this is called as corrugation. So the surface is parakeratotic and surface is definitely not smooth, and that is called as corrugated surface. Now if you observe this epithelial lining appears to be uniform thickness throughout, and if I count the number of cells right from the basement membrane here till the parakeratin surface, it will definitely be about 5 to 8 cell layers thick. So if I count, say for example, let us start counting here: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So it's approximately about 5 to 8 cell layers thickness. And most importantly, if you notice the basal cells, and these basal cells are cuboidal to columnar in their morphology, and this lining epithelium typically shows the basal cells being palisaded. When I say palisaded, the cells are neatly arranged one next to the other. Look at their color. They are darkly stained, which we are going to call them as hyperchromatic. So the basal cells are cuboidal to columnar, darkly stained, hyperchromatic, and observe their nuclei. Beautifully they are arranged away from the basement membrane, and this is called as a reverse polarization. So they are polarized away from the basement membrane, they are hyperchromatic, they are cuboidal to columnar in nature, and on the surface we have parakeratotic surface, typically that is corrugated. These are the basic essential features of an odontogenic keratocyst. I'll repeat: uniform cell layers of thickness of about 5 to 8 cell layers thick. The basal cells are cuboidal to columnar in morphology. The nuclei away from the basement membrane, which we are going to call it as polarized away from the basement membrane, and the surface is corrugated, and we typically have parakeratin surface, and underlying connective tissue capsule is quite mature. These are the essential features what we typically see in an odontogenic keratocyst. But we need to keep in mind these typical features are only seen when the cyst is not inflamed. We all know that odontogenic keratocyst is a developmental cyst. The mediation of the cyst or pathogenesis of the cyst is not through inflammation. Hence, when a cyst is not inflamed, we typically tend to see these features. However, if the cyst is inflamed, the typical features like just now what we described might be not so easily seen. The inflammatory cells will have their effect on the epithelial lining, and it tends to change the epithelial lining morphology. Now let us see if the epithelial cells are inflamed, or if the epithelial lining is inflamed, what can happen. So let me see other areas. And do we see any inflammation in other areas? We tend to see some inflammation here. Yes. When you notice this, there's a dense amount of inflammation here. Yeah, you see these tiny blue dots. These are the lymphocytes, and these cells are your inflammatory cells, and they are kind of having an effect on the epithelial lining. If you see this epithelial lining, because of the inflammation, the epithelium starts to proliferate, and no more the uniform thickness of 5 to 8 cell layers thickness is maintained. Instead, it starts to show the plexiform arrangement like what we see in a radicular cyst, or the arcading pattern what we see in a radicular cyst. So the inflammation has a huge effect. It is trying to mask all the features of typical odontogenic keratocyst. The same picture here, even if I move on this side, if I scan on this side, the similar picture, the inflammation has totally changed the way the lining epithelium appears in the typical keratocystic odontogenic tumor. Look at this. It has a typical plexiform or a network like arrangement, totally changed due to dense amount of inflammation seen here. So definitely when an odontogenic keratocyst is inflamed, you cannot really expect a proper typical odontogenic keratocystic lining. Let us see some other areas here. You see this typical plexiform arrangement? Yeah. Odontogenic keratocysts are known to have these daughter cysts. Now, what are these daughter cysts? If you keenly observe in the connective tissue capsule of odontogenic keratocyst, there are epithelial islands, and this is one such example of an epithelial island. And this epithelial island will show central keratinization with the lumen formation. So this is a very, very good example of a daughter cyst where you see, so this was an epithelial island with showing central keratinization, the cells producing a lot of keratin, and at the same time you have the epithelial lining with a lumen. So this forms a tiny daughter cyst, and this is one of the most important reasons why this keratocyst has a high amount of recurrence rate. One more important feature of odontogenic keratocyst is lies within the epithelial lining. If we observe this, the epithelial lining, the stratified squamous parakeratinized epithelial lining of odontogenic keratocyst is typically folded. As I told, it is corrugated, the surface is thrown into folds. And one important feature is the epithelial lining tends to easily split from the underlying connective tissue. So here we can beautifully see that you have the epithelial lining with a lot of folding, and there is separation between the epithelial lining and the underlying connective tissue capsule. Now this is one of the important feature why it is difficult to remove the cyst as such, because the epithelial lining is first of all folded, and upon this the lining easily gets separated from the underlying connective tissue capsule. We have another cyst with subtle differences which looks like odontogenic keratocyst, and this is called as ortho-keratinized odontogenic cyst, or simply we call them as OOC. The subtle differences exist within the epithelial lining where the basal cells are not columnar, instead they're flat to cuboidal with minimal palisading. At the same time, the surface of which is not parakeratinized, instead it is ortho-keratinized, and because of it being ortho-keratinized, the amount of keratin produced is abundant when compared to the parakeratinized variant. Radiologically, odontogenic keratocyst can present with either unilocular or more commonly multilocular radiolucencies quite similar to your ameloblastomas. These cysts are preferred to be removed via enucleation whenever possible or to avoid recurrence. However, depending upon the age and size of the lesion, marsupialization with follow-up can also be attempted. If you feel this has helped you a bit, please show your appreciation by hitting that like button, share with your friends, subscribe if you have not subscribed yet, and do not forget to press that bell icon to stay updated with my next upcoming video. And as usual, I'll see you all soon. Thank you.